The cabin held 18 inches of log above the grade. The rest sat inside the south slope of a hill below Wonder Lake, banked over on three sides with the same glacial till the Denali road crew piles every spring when they cut the loop back open. From half a mile out, you could not see it. From a quarter mile out, you could see one small window facing south, and, on a winter night, the amber leak of a kerosene lamp behind the glass. A retired Navy SEAL inside with a Belgian malinois across his right boot, and nothing else. The roof was sod, 30 degrees off level, with the moss already taking. Two men off the Muldrow Glacier route, lost in the wrong drainage on a January night in 2023, would walk down the slope toward that single window, because it was the only thing in the world that was not the same color as the snow. One of them would stop breathing for 9 seconds on the trestle table inside, and the other one would lose half a toe and most of the certainty he had about himself. They would both come out alive. The drafter who designed the cabin had been dead for 5 years by then. I will get to the night. I want to walk in first. The man I am calling Frank Sutherland is composite, as Alaska dugout stories usually are. The SEAL's name I have changed, for obvious reasons, and the location is composite over several places below Wonder Lake. The specific point may differ from what a current Park Service map shows. The wife and the engineering decisions and the dog are real. The roll of plans he carried in October of 2019 is real. I have it in front of me as I write this, smelling like the cardboard tube it has lived in for 6 years. Frank was 51 years old that October, retired, Senior Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Team 8, the Atlantic side, 27 years in. He had walked away in the autumn of 2018, 8 months after his wife Margaret died, and he had spent that first winter in a rental apartment in Wasilla, doing nothing very useful with himself except teaching his malinois the Dutch word for stay. The malinois was Tess, 7 years old, ex-Lackland, brindle on the muzzle, a working dog who had been retired off a sustained attack program a year and a half before, because she had stopped accepting bite suit handlers she did not personally know. Per team's doctrine, that is the kind of thing that ends a malinois career and starts another one. She was a stubborn dog. She was loyal in the way working dogs are loyal, which is not the way the Hallmark cards put it. She would have killed for him without raising her head off the rug. She did not understand the word affection. She understood the word stay. The last 3 miles in from the park road were the worst miles I have ever walked, and I did not walk them. Frank did. I am quoting him. The track follows a series of small benches that fall away to the west, with willow on the north sides where the wind catches it, and bare stone on the south sides where the sun reaches in summer. In October, the willows were already going to copper, and the first snow had hit 8 days before, 4 inches, that did not melt out of the lee. Frank carried a 45-pound pack and a roll of butcher paper in a hard cardboard tube the diameter of his forearm. The roll was the cabin. Margaret had drawn it. The malinois carried nothing. Tess walked on point, 6 feet ahead of him, watching the willows the way she had learned to watch the willows after the 3rd grisly sign on the 2nd mile. The plans inside the tube were Margaret's. She had been a structural drafter for 19 years at P&D Engineers in Anchorage, a real firm. The men who designed half the cold soil foundations in the upper state work out of that office. She had a way of building cabins on the back of legal pads while she watched television. After her diagnosis, in the summer of 2017, she had spent 6 months drawing this one. She had a brother who hunted out of Cantwell, and she had grown up coming up the park road in a suburban with her parents, and she had wanted to die looking at the south face of the high one. She did not live to see the cabin built. She handed Frank the roll the week before her last hospital stay and said to him in the voice she had developed by then, which was a voice that did not waste anything, "Build it the way it is drawn. Don't pretty it up." Then she said, "It does not need a porch." I have asked Frank twice why she said that last bit, and twice he has given me the same answer, which is that he does not exactly know, but he thinks she had seen the porches at Kantishna and at the old Denali roadhouses, and had decided that a porch was where wind goes to argue with a house, and she did not want her cabin arguing with anything. She had built a structure on paper that did not argue. It sat inside the hill. The south wall, the only one above grade by more than 2 feet, carried a single small window the size of a kitchen towel, and a door, and that was all the cabin had to say to the weather. He set the roll down at the future site on the afternoon of October 4th, and he sat on a flat-topped boulder for 40 minutes without unrolling it. Tess waited. She had learned to wait the way Lackland teaches their dogs to wait, not lying down, not pacing, but a stillness that contains motion, the way a coiled spring contains motion. The wind moved through the spruce above the bench. Frank looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly. I have seen this happen with retired team guys at the start of something they have wanted to do for a long time. They get to the place, and they cannot believe that the place is the place. In the rucksack, he had a hand-cranked drill, a single-bit felling axe, a Hudson Bay axe, a draw knife, a one-man crosscut saw with a cherry handle his father had cut for it in 1978, and a roll of muslin for marking layout lines. He had a small folding shovel for the perimeter test holes. He had a hand-cranked satellite phone the size of a paperback book. He had 2 cans of stove fuel, a sleeping bag rated to -30, a kerosene lamp, a tin of matches, a tin of waterproof matches, and a small notebook with a green leather cover that his wife had bought him in 1996. The notebook had 8 blank pages left in the back, and on the front pages it had every BUD/S student's name from his last class as a sub-instructor in 2004. He had written nothing in it for 15 years. He intended to start. That intention did not last as long as he had hoped, because what he found that first afternoon when he finally stood up off the boulder and walked the site was that Margaret had been right about the porch, and also about the south face, and also about the bench above the seep on the east side, and that what she had drawn was not a thing he could improve, only build. He walked around the footprint of the cabin 3 times in slow circles. Tess walked the perimeter twice in her own pattern, which was to nose every overhang of every rock and to stop at the upslope corner and stare into the spruce for a count of 9, which was as far as she could count before she lost interest. I want to tell you what brought him to that bench. The official version goes like this. Frank ran his last operational deployment in 2012. He was 38 then, a senior chief running a small fly team out of Stuttgart on detached duty for African Special Operations. He went out the back of a C-17 at the edge of the parachute envelope, at altitude, in a cold corridor, over what they had every reason to believe was a quiet drop zone in the Sahel. The drop was not quiet. Something on the ground became clear at terminal velocity, and Frank made a course adjustment with his right arm at a wind speed that should not have permitted course adjustments, and he came down 2 seconds late through a roof of corrugated steel that nobody had told the planners about. He broke his back at L2 and L3. He cracked his pelvis. He shattered his right calcaneus. He spent 6 weeks in traction in Landstuhl and 4 months in a halo in San Diego. And at the end of it, he learned to walk again well enough that he could pass a modified screening and stay on as an instructor. He was the only one of his stick who hit the roof. The other 3 came down in the courtyard, dropped their main canopies, recovered, and finished the mission while Frank lay on the corrugated steel 40 feet down a hole in the building, looking at the sky between 2 pieces of bent rebar and thinking, with the strange clarity that injuries deliver, that he had been wrong about everything important in his life. He did not specify at the time what he had been wrong about. He worked it out over the following 6 years. He worked some of it out by getting better. He worked some of it out by marrying Margaret, who was a friend of his sister's, in 2014. He worked the rest of it out by sitting in the kitchen of their Wasilla rental in the autumn of 2017, while Margaret told him, in her drafter's voice, what an oncologist had told her 3 hours before. I'm telling you this because the cabin is impossible to understand without the back. Margaret drew it during chemotherapy. She drew it during the 2nd round, after the surgery did not get what it was meant to get. She drew it on a folding TV tray in their bedroom with a felt-tip marker on translation paper because her hands had started to shake by then, and pencil lead would not show up to her satisfaction. She drew the bermed walls, the dovetail joinery, no metal fasteners, none, because she had been raised by her father to believe that ferrous metal in permafrost soil is a slow-motion structural failure. The French drain to bedrock at the perimeter of the berm, the angle of the roof, the size and placement of the single window, the offset of the chimney through the center line of the roof rather than the gable end. Less heat loss, fewer roof penetrations, the height of the door head, low enough to drop heat loss area, high enough that Frank could stand under it without ducking. The depth of the floor below grade, 28 inches, exactly the depth at which the seasonal thaw at that latitude rebalances in late June, and the layout of the trestle table where they would have eaten dinner if she had lived. She drew the table for 2 people. She drew it knowing she would not sit at it. I cannot tell you what that costs to do. Frank cannot either exactly. He pitched a small tarp under a black spruce on the bench above the cabin site at last light on October 4th. He lit a low fire. He did not lay it large. There had been a fresh grizzly print at the creek crossing a 1/4 mile down slope, hind foot pad wider than his outstretched palm, and the bear was working the late silver run in the small drainages between Wonder Lake and the McKinley Bar. He cooked rice in a small pot. He fed Tess a 1/4 pound of dehydrated lamb and rice, and a strip of dried elk from the breast pocket of his coat. She ate slowly and watched the ridge. I have worked with malinois for 20 years. I know they do not lie. I have not, however, ever owned one. They are not pets in any sense that the word usually carries. They are working partners with their own opinions, and the good ones develop a vocabulary of small physical signals that the handler reads the way a fly fisherman reads a riffle. Tess had 9 specific signals that Frank could name. One of them was a shift of weight onto her left hip when she became uncertain about something she had heard but not yet smelled. Another was the way she pressed her right shoulder into his thigh when she wanted him to know that a thing she had been tracking was now downwind of them, which is the most dangerous configuration in bear country. She gave him that signal twice that first night. The first time, around 8 in the evening, it was a young black sow with a yearling who passed 40 yards down slope and continued east without reaching for them. The second time, around 2 in the morning, was a grizzly. He saw nothing. He smelled nothing. He felt only the press of her right shoulder into his thigh, 3 times, the slow pulse of which was her way of telling him she was certain. He did not move. He held a hand on her ribs. Per team's doctrine, you do not move when a malinois who has been right 10,000 times is leaning into you. You wait. They wait. They waited 11 minutes by his watch. Then she lifted her head, looked uphill, exhaled once, and lay back down. He slept the rest of that night the way a man sleeps when he has 8 blank pages in a green notebook and a roll of plans in a tube, and a malinois between him and the wind. He woke at 4. He drank coffee. He looked at the slope below the bench where the cabin would go, and he ran one hand over the cardboard tube, the only thing besides his dog that connected him to the woman who had drawn it. And he said quietly, to nobody but Tess, "All right, tomorrow the first course." Then he corrected himself the way veterans correct themselves when they are talking to dogs, because dogs do not give them grace for inaccuracies. Today the perimeter, tomorrow the first course. Tess thumped her tail once against the spruce duff. The wind shifted to the north, which was the direction the cabin would be banked against, and the first real cold of the season slid down off the high one and settled across the bench. And that was the night, properly speaking, that the cabin began. Hank Bowers walked into the site on the morning of the 3rd day of laying out string lines, and the first thing he said, without saying good morning, without taking off his right glove, without setting down the second of the 2 coffees in the steel thermos he carried in his offhand, was that the cabin would rot in 2 seasons, because the spring melt would run off the permafrost lens above the bench and pool against the back wall and find every weakness in the dovetailing within 30 months. He said all of that in one breath. Then he set down the second coffee on a stump, lifted his ball cap an inch off his head, scratched the place where the cap had been, and said, "I assume you've thought about that, son." Hank was 68 years old. He had been a wildlife technician for the Park Service in the early 80s, an interpretive guide in the 90s, and a retired contractor since 2007. He had built 4 cabins in the Upper Park Road corridor for ranger use and 2 for his own, and he had lost both of his to the same enemy. The south-facing slopes that look so good on a topo map and turn into a soup of frozen mud and snowmelt by the 3rd week of May. He was, I think it's fair to say, the only man in the Wonder Lake Basin who genuinely understood what Margaret had drawn. He just thought she had drawn it wrong. Frank set the level down on the string line, turned, looked at Hank the way a senior chief looks at a man who is half right, and said, "I have thought about it. My wife thought about it more." Then he pointed down slope to the line of orange surveyor's flagging he had pegged the previous evening. French drain, to bedrock, around the whole berm, washed gravel up to the floor line, filter fabric inside the gravel, daylight outlet 200 feet west below the seep, where the slope tips into the Alder. Hank looked. He looked for about 30 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee, took the lid off, drank a third of it, put the lid back on and said, "Show me on paper." That was the morning the cabin stopped being only Margaret's. Hank sat down at the trestle Frank had improvised out of 2 sawbucks and an inch-thick poplar plank, and Frank unrolled the drainage detail, and the 2 men spent 90 minutes going through the angle of the French drain. 3% fall to daylight, not 5. 5 would scour the bed and undermine the berm in a freshet. The depth of the trench, 40 inches below the deepest active layer. The spacing of the perimeter drain tile, 4 inches on center for the upslope quarter, 6 inches elsewhere, and the question of whether Margaret had specified a vapor barrier above the gravel or below it, which she had not specified, and which Hank thought she should have. They argued about that one for 20 minutes. Frank said his wife had not been a believer in vapor barriers in earth-banked construction because she thought they trapped moisture inside the structural envelope rather than letting it migrate out through the log. Hank said he respected that opinion, but disagreed. Tess lay in the shade of a young white spruce 6 feet from the trestle and watched both men the way she watched a tree line with no smell to it. Present, alert, not yet certain. By the end of the 90 minutes, the two old men had reached a compromise, which was no vapor barrier above the gravel, but a thin layer of birch bark, harvested locally, laid sticky side down between the gravel and the floor joists, the way Hank's father had done it in 1963 on a cabin near Talkeetna that was still standing. I am telling you this argument because the cabin would be standing 6 years later, the night 2 men walked off the wrong side of the Muldrow Glacier route at -34, partly because of the French drain and partly because of the birch bark. I am also telling you because of what Margaret would have said about the birch bark if she had been there at the trestle. Frank thinks she would have said yes. He thinks she would have said it the same way she said most things in the last 6 months, which was without wasting any of the breath she had left. By the end of the first week of October, the perimeter test holes were dug. The French drain trench was open to bedrock around 3 sides of the footprint. The gravel had been hauled in by Hank's son's quad and trailer from a borrow pit 4 miles east, and the first course of logs, 6 matched white spruce, 8 inches at the small end, 12 at the butt, debarked by Frank with a draw knife, while Tess watched chipmunks raid the chip pile, was lying parallel to the string lines, dry-fitted, ready to take saddle notches. The snow held off. The wind held off. Frank slept under the tarp for 9 nights. He fed Tess off a tin plate at the corner of the chip pile every evening at 6, and she ate slowly because she had learned at Lackland that eating fast in front of a handler was a sign of insecurity, and she did not believe she was insecure. The walls went up between October 14th and November 2nd. 3 courses a day, more or less, depending on the size of the timber. Frank cut dovetail notches at every corner, using a Hudson Bay axe for the rough and a slick for the finish, working from a layout Margaret had drawn in axonometric on the second sheet of the roll. The dovetails were tight enough that Hank, on his second visit, ran a sheet of newsprint between 2 stacked logs at a corner and could not feed the paper more than a ½ inch in. He said nothing about it the first time he tried. He said something the second time. The thing he said was, "Your wife was good." Frank said yes, she was. Hank did not press the past tense. He pressed the dovetail with his thumb. Then he asked who had taught Frank to cut a dovetail like that. Frank said his father, who had cut bridge timbers for the Alaska Railroad in the 1950s, out of Cantwell, and Frank's wife, who had drawn the joinery as a young woman after watching her own father do it on a smokehouse near Healy. Hank thought about that for a long moment and then said, "It is a small valley, even when it covers 600 miles. Frank said yes. They left it there. On the 7th course of logs, Frank stopped at noon, sat down on a stump in the middle of the half-built footprint, took a folded piece of paper out of the breast pocket of his coat, and read it. Tess walked over from the chip pile and sat down beside him with her shoulder against his thigh in the way she had when she was uncertain about an emotional weight she could not place. Frank read the paper twice. He folded it. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at the south wall, which by then was 3 courses high, and he said quietly, to nobody but the dog, the thing his wife had written on the back of the building permit application, the one she had filled out for him in October of 2017 and signed, with her drafter's hand still steady at that point, on the dotted line that read, Owner. The thing she had written under the signature in her round, private hand was this: Frank, build the cabin the way you build a man, from the ground up, with nothing inside to argue with itself. He had not read that line for 19 months. Tess pressed harder against his thigh. He held one hand on her ribs, the way he had held one hand on her ribs the night the grizzly had passed below them. He sat that way for 11 minutes. Then he stood up and went back to the dovetailing. I tell you this because what Margaret had built on paper and what Frank was building out of spruce was not only a cabin. The fact that everyone in this story is aware of this, Frank, Tess, Hank Bowers, eventually the 2 climbers off the Muldrow route, without ever quite saying it, is what makes the cabin the cabin. The walls were spruce. The grief was structural. I cannot put it more honestly than that. The roof went on in the first week of November. Frank had cut and seasoned the rafters in the rented Wasilla garage the previous winter. 12 sticks of 2x8 Sitka spruce, kiln-dried, 12 feet long, and he had brought them in on Hank's son's quad and trailer the same way the gravel had come in. The rafters sat at 30 degrees off the level on a center ridge beam, the angle Margaret had drawn for one specific reason, which is that 30 degrees is the angle at which sod, properly seeded with the native grass community that grows along the lower slopes of the basin, will shed the maximum amount of summer rain without sliding off the structure during the spring thaw. Hank had argued for 28, citing his 1976 experience with a sod-roofed cabin near Toklat that had begun to slip in the 2nd May. Frank had checked Margaret's drawings and then handed Hank her side notes. Hank had read them. He had handed them back. He had said, 30's right. I was wrong about the Toklat. We had it at 32. The chimney came up through the center line of the roof rather than through the gable end. I cannot confirm, I heard this from a teammate later, that the center of roof flue placement was an established frontier practice in the upper Yukon Basin in the 1930s, but it was certainly common in the central Norway High Valley Stuga from which Margaret's grandmother had come, and it is the placement that loses the least heat, because the flue runs through the warm air column at the apex of the room, rather than along the cold side wall. Frank set it in masonry that he had cured under tarps over the previous summer at his rental in Wasilla, in a steel form he had welded himself. The flue itself was a 6-inch insulated stainless pipe. The masonry shoulder rose 2 feet above the sod roof outside, capped with a stone he had carried up from the bench below the McKinley bar in late September. The stone was flat. It was also, by his own account, the heaviest thing he had carried in 27 years that was not a wounded man. By the 2nd week of November, the sod was laid. He had cut it himself in panels, from the slope to the east, where the slope angle and the grass community were closest to the slope, and the grass community on his own roof, and he had laid the panels green side down on a layer of waterproof felt, with a second course of panels green side up over the first, packed tight, walked in. He had seeded the upper face with a mix of native blue joint and wood reed grass that he had collected from along the seep over 4 trips that summer. By the 2nd week of November, with the first sustained cold settling in and the morning lows already passing -12, the sod was frozen in place. By the 2nd week of November, the cabin was a thing. He moved in on the night of November 14th. The kerosene lamp went on the shelf above the trestle table, which was the table Margaret had drawn for 2 people. The plaid blanket, a wool blanket she had bought him in 1998, before they were married, when she had been the friend of his sister, went on the cot under the south window. Tess got a folded wool rug at the foot of the stove. Frank lit the first fire at 5:40 in the afternoon. He cooked elk and potato stew. He fed Tess. He sat at the trestle table and read the front pages of the green leather notebook, which is to say, the names of the BUD/S students from his last sub-instructor class in 2004, the way a priest reads the parish dead. He turned to the back of the notebook. He uncapped a pen. He wrote, in his careful hand, November 14th, 2019. Walls hold. Floor solid. Flue drawers. Tess on rug. Cold outside. Warm inside. Margaret would say, it does not need anything else, and she would be right. He underlined the last clause. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the shelf above the trestle and walked outside in his shirt sleeves into the November dark and stood for a moment looking at the small amber square of the south window, the only thing in the long, sloping basin that was not the same color as the snow. The wind was from the north. He could not feel it inside the cabin. He could not feel it outside the cabin either, because the cabin sat in the lee of itself, and the berm took the wind on 3 sides and did not give it back. He stood there for 4 minutes. Then he heard something off to the southeast, on the ridge above the bench, a small shifting sound that could have been a snow load releasing from a spruce branch, or could have been the small movement of a large animal repositioning at the limit of his hearing. Tess, at the door behind him, made the low sound in her chest that was not a growl exactly. It was the sound she made when she was telling him to come inside, without ordering him to. He came inside. He closed the door. He sat down by the stove. Tess lay across his right boot, the way she had learned to do at Lackland, across the boot, not beside it, and he could feel through the leather the slow movement of her ribs as she breathed. The fire ticked in the stove. The kerosene lamp threw a circle of warm light across the trestle table, where Margaret had drawn the table for 2. Outside, somewhere on the ridge above the bench, the thing he had heard moved again, and then was still. What none of us knew on that night, sitting at our respective trestles wherever we were in November of 2019, was that the cabin would sit through 4 winters before it would be asked to do the thing it had been built to do. On a January night in the 4th year, a man named Daniel Ross would press his frostbitten face against the single small window of the south wall, because it was the only thing in the long, sloping basin that was not the same color as the snow. And a man named Caleb Marquez would collapse face down in the willows 40 yards down slope. And Tess would smell the second man before either Frank or Daniel had seen him. And the French drain Margaret had drawn at 3% full to daylight would still be moving meltwater at -34, because the design was right. None of that was anywhere on the horizon that November 14th. The fire was drawing. The dog was on his boot. The cabin held. The next morning, the wind was still in the north, and the first real snow of the season, 6 inches, dry, settled by 10, began at dawn and did not stop until the following afternoon. By the end of it, the cabin was, for the first time, what Margaret had drawn it to be, which was a thing that could not be seen from a quarter-mile out by anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Tess woke him at 1:14 in the morning on the 22nd of January, 2023. She did not bark. She did not lift her head off the rug at the foot of the stove. She pressed her right shoulder into the side of the cot under the south window, 2 short presses and 1 long, and the cot was a folding aluminium frame with a tight canvas deck on it, and the long press deflected the deck enough that Frank felt the pressure travel through the canvas into his ribs as he lay on his right side. He had slept with one ear on the dog for 31 years of marriage and 4 winters in this cabin. He came up out of sleep without moving anything except his eyes. The interior of the cabin was at 52 degrees. He knew it was 52 without looking, because the kerosene lamp on the trestle, which had a small bimetallic strip thermometer screwed to the base, made a faint clicking when the strip flexed past the 50 mark and again past the 60 mark, and the last click he had heard before sleeping was the 50. The stove had burned down to coals. The cot under the south window held the residual warmth of the previous evening's fire, trapped against the inside face of the bermed wall. The window was a small, dark square. Outside, the night was the kind of cold that only happens in deep January in the upper basin. Windless, dry, the air so still that sound carried unevenly, as if the cold had its own preference for which frequencies it would let through. Frank reached down with his right hand and rested his palm on the flat of Tess's shoulder blade. He did not speak. She did not move. He felt the rapid, small twitches in the deep muscle that meant she was tracking something with her ears that she had not yet identified. He waited. After perhaps 40 seconds, she shifted her weight onto her left hip. The signal, the one he had learned to read first, the uncertain but active signal. And then she stood up and walked the 4 paces from the cot to the south window and pressed her muzzle against the sill at the base of the glass. He sat up. He swung his bare feet onto the floor, Margaret's spruce floor, 2-inch tongue and groove over the birch bark layer over the gravel, and he put on the wool trousers folded on the chair. He put on the wool shirt. He put on the second pair of wool socks and the felted wool boots. He put on a wool watch cap, because the heat loss from a bare head at this kind of cold is a thing veterans of cold weather work do not forget. He picked up the kerosene lamp by the wire handle, but he did not raise the wick. He kept the flame at the level it had been at since supper time, which was the size of a child's fingernail. He walked to the south window. Tess shifted to let him stand at the sill. He looked out. The starlight was enough. The moon had set at 1:45, to make the snowfield below the cabin readable as a slope of slightly lighter grey against the darker grey of the willows along the bench's lower edge. He could see no movement in the willows. He could see no movement on the open slope. He could see, however, faint and unrhythmic, and at the very limit of perception, 2 small dark shapes against the slope, perhaps 300 yards downslope and slightly to the west, near where the bench tipped over into the steeper drainage that ran toward the McKinley Bar. The 2 shapes were not moving the way an animal moves. They were not moving the way men move under their own steam either. They were moving the way men move, who are trying very hard to make their bodies do something their bodies have decided they would rather not do. Frank set the lamp down on the sill. He stepped back from the window. He turned to Tess and said, in a voice no louder than a normal exhale, "Bleib." "Stay." She sat. He pulled a down parka off the hook by the door, -40 rated, military surplus, the one he had been issued in a different decade for a different reason, and he laid it on the trestle within reach. He went to the stove. He opened the door. He loaded 3 pieces of dry spruce on the coals. He closed the door and opened the damper to a half burn. He turned and put a kettle of water on the top of the stove. He picked up the wool blanket off the cot and laid it on the trestle next to the parka. He picked up the heavy wool socks from the dry line above the stove, a second pair, never worn, and added them to the trestle. He moved fast. He did not speak. Tess watched him. I am taking the time to walk you through these 30 seconds because what happens next is going to feel sudden. And it was not sudden. By the time he opened the cabin door at 1:19 in the morning, the cabin had already begun to prepare itself for 2 men. The stove was rising, the kettle was on, the blanket and socks and parka were within arm's reach. A second wool blanket was folded under the trestle. The first aid kit, a real one, a JTAC Corpsman's kit he had carried since the Sahel, was sitting closed but unlatched on the floor under the table. He had done all of this in less than half a minute. Per team's doctrine, you do not run the procedure when the casualty arrives. You run the procedure before. You have it laid out, and your hands know where everything is. And when the door opens, you are already 3 steps ahead. He opened the door. The cold reached in the way that cold reaches at -34, not as a movement of air, but as a sudden absence of warmth. He stepped out onto the small flat of packed snow he had cleared in front of the door. He let Tess come to the threshold, but no further. He did not yet call out. He raised the kerosene lamp. The 2 shapes downslope stopped. 300 yards is a long way at 1 in the morning in deep January at the latitude of Wonder Lake, and the human voice does not carry well in air that cold. But a kerosene flame raised slowly above a parka does carry. It carries because it is the only thing on the slope that is not a color the snow is. The 2 shapes did not call out. They moved instead toward the lamp. They moved the way men move when they have stopped believing in their feet, but have not yet stopped believing in their direction. Frank watched them come. He waited until they were within 70 yards. Then he set the lamp on the snow at his feet. He went back inside. He picked up the parka and the blanket. He put on his own snowshoes. He told Tess again, "Bleib." Then he walked down slope. He met the first man at 50 yards out. The first man was tall, 6'1" or so, in a synthetic mountaineering shell that had been white once and was now a pale gray from blowing snow embedded in the fabric. His name, as Frank would learn over the next 90 minutes, was Daniel Ross. He was 38 years old. He was a cardiothoracic surgical resident at the University of Washington Medical Center, and he and his climbing partner, Caleb Marquez, who was 29 and an attorney from Portland, had bivouacked on the Carstens Ridge above the Muldrow Glacier at 15,400 feet 41 hours earlier, and had been forced to descend in the wrong direction because the wind had pinned them off their fixed line, and they had lost the line in a whiteout. They had glissaded down a couloir they should not have glissaded down. They had ended up below the Wickersham Wall in a drainage they did not know. They had walked for 26 hours in steadily falling temperatures, with one glove between them, after Caleb's right glove had come off in a step-down at 16 hours, and Caleb's right hand had been wrapped in the sleeve of his own jacket since then. The first man said nothing when Frank reached him. He looked at Frank's face for several seconds. Then he said, in a voice that came out of him at half power, "There is another man behind me. 40 yards. He sat down. He cannot stand up. We tried." Then he tipped forward at the waist into Frank's arms. Frank caught him with his right shoulder under the man's chest, walked him backwards 3 steps to keep him from going to his knees, and held him there while he looked down slope for the second man. I want to tell you what Frank was looking for. He was looking for what an aim point at low light at 50 yards can pick out, which is a shape against a slope. He saw it. The second shape was no longer moving. It was approximately 40 yards down slope, in the willows, on the line between Frank and the upper edge of the McKinley bar. The shape was sitting. It was not lying. It was sitting upright, slightly tilted to the right, the way a man sits when he has lost the use of his right hand and is trying to keep the wind off the side of his face. Tess, behind Frank, made the low sound in her chest that was not a growl. Frank turned his head a quarter-inch and said, "Here. Come." She came. He laid Daniel Ross down on the snow with the parka under his shoulders. He put the wool blanket over Daniel's chest. He said in Daniel's ear, "I am Frank. I am taking you to a fire. I am going to get your friend first. Tess will stay with you. Do not move. Do not stand up. Tess will keep you warm." Daniel managed to say one syllable that might have been okay. Frank looked at Tess. He pointed at Daniel's chest. He said, "Hold. Bleib." She lay across Daniel Ross's torso, her shoulder along his ribs, her right paw against the side of his face, and she put her weight on him the way she had been trained at Lackland to put her weight on a downed handler in cold weather drill. She would not move from that position for the next 18 minutes. Frank walked the 40 yards down slope toward Caleb Marquez at a pace that looked, from the outside, like he was not hurrying. He was not hurrying because he was thinking about what he was going to find. He had carried wounded men out of buildings in 3 countries. He had read every cold-weather casualty card the teams put out between 1995 and 2012. He knew what hypothermia looked like at the second stage transition, when the muscle shivers stop and the core temperature has fallen below 90 degrees, and the body starts diverting blood to the brain and the heart in a way the layman calls paradoxical undressing, but which is in fact the slow logic of a system that has run out of options. He knew that Caleb had been sitting for at least 3 minutes by then, because the snow around him had been printed flat by his weight and not yet drifted. He reached Caleb at 60 seconds past the door. Caleb's face was the color of green chalk. His eyes were open. He was not shivering. The fabric of his shell jacket was unzipped to the navel, paradoxical undressing, and his right hand, wrapped in the sleeve, was held against his stomach. Frank knelt in the snow. He put one gloved hand under Caleb's chin and lifted Caleb's head until their eyes met. He said, "Caleb, I am Frank. I am taking you to a fire. I am going to lift you now. I am going to put you over my left shoulder. Do not fight me. Do not move your right arm." Caleb's mouth moved. No sound came out. Frank lifted him. Caleb weighed perhaps 170 pounds in the clothes he was wearing. Frank's back at L2 and L3 had been built back by surgical fusion in 2012. There is a feeling in a surgically fused back, under load, in cold, that men who have had spinal fusion will recognize and that no one else will believe. He carried Caleb up the 40 yards to where Tess lay across Daniel Ross. He did not put Caleb down. He said to Tess, "Frei, Daniel, aufstehen." Release. Then to Daniel, "Get up. Hold on to my belt. We are going to the fire." Daniel got up. He was steadier than he had been 3 minutes before because Tess had given him 18 minutes of her body heat across his chest. He held Frank's belt. Tess walked at Frank's right side. They covered the 50 yards back to the cabin in a little under 4 minutes, which is, I want you to understand, an extremely fast 4 minutes for a man carrying 170 pounds across a frozen slope with a fused L2. The kerosene lamp was still burning in the snow at the cabin door. Frank stepped over it. He carried Caleb across the threshold. He laid him on the trestle table on his back, head toward the south window, feet toward the stove. He did not put Caleb on the cot. The trestle table was the table Margaret had drawn for two, but it was also a clean, flat surface at the height of his own waist, which is the surface a corpsman wants for a casualty. He cut Caleb's jacket open with the rescue shears from the first aid kit. He cut the inner layer. He cut the base layer. He left Caleb's wool long johns on. He pulled off Caleb's boots. He cut Caleb's wet socks off at the ankle. He looked at Caleb's feet. Daniel, behind him, was sitting in the chair by the stove, the wool blanket around his shoulders, his face slowly turning from grey-white to white-pink in the warmth that was rising off the loaded stove. Tess sat between Daniel's knees, not lying, sitting, with her shoulder against Daniel's right shin, which was the position she had decided on without being told. Daniel had one hand on the top of her head. Caleb's left foot was second-degree frostbite to the metatarsals. The skin was waxy white over the toes, with the dusky red mottle starting along the arch. His right foot was first-degree, recoverable. His right hand, when Frank unwrapped the jacket sleeve, was third-degree to the distal phalanges of the index and middle fingers. The tissue had gone past white into the hard, glassy grey that does not come back. Frank looked at it for 2 seconds. He set the hand down on a folded wool cloth on the table. He moved to Caleb's feet. He put a kettle of warm water, not hot, warm, body temperature, on the floor next to the table. He soaked 2 wool cloths in the warm water. He wrapped them around Caleb's left foot, loose. He did the same for the right foot. He did not put Caleb's feet in the water. Per team's doctrine, you do not put a frozen extremity into water that is more than a few degrees above tissue temperature, because the rewarming gradient kills the tissue you are trying to save. He worked the water at body temperature for 35 minutes, replacing the cloths every 4 minutes, watching the color return along the metatarsals. At 9 minutes past 2 in the morning, Caleb Marquez stopped breathing for the first time. Frank had his left hand on Caleb's sternum, monitoring respiration, when the chest stopped rising. He looked at his watch. He counted. He counted 4. He counted 5. He counted 6. He counted 7. He counted 8. He shifted his weight to put both hands on the sternum to start compressions. He counted 9. Caleb breathed in. The breath was a long, ragged inhale that ended in a small, dry sob. His eyes did not open. His chest began to rise and fall again in the slow, shallow pattern of a body that had been 30 seconds from deciding it would rather not continue, and had then, for reasons that have to do with brainstem chemistry and the warm wool cloths and the smell of kerosene and wood smoke and the small movement of a Belgian malinois on the floor that Caleb could not see, but his nervous system could, decided that it would. Frank let the breath complete. He took his hands off the sternum. He laid the wool cloth back over Caleb's right foot. He looked at Daniel Ross in the chair by the stove. Daniel was looking at him. The cabin held at 52 degrees. The porch thermometer outside the south window, the one Frank checked at 6 every morning and 9 every evening, was reading -34. The French drain Margaret had drawn at 3% fall to daylight, 200 feet to the west under the alder, was still moving meltwater. The cabin had been asked to do the thing it had been built to do. The answer was holding. Dawn at that latitude in the last week of January arrives quietly. There is no sunrise as a person from a lower latitude understands the term. The sky south of the high one shifts between 7 and 7:30 From the dark grey it has been for 16 hours into a paler grey that hints at the colour blue without ever quite reaching it. By 8, there is a softness against the south window that is not yet light, but is no longer night. Frank was at the trestle table at the south window, with a tin cup of coffee in his right hand and his left hand resting on Tess's back. Tess was lying on the floor, with her right shoulder against his right boot. Caleb Marquez was asleep on the cot under the south window. His feet were wrapped in clean, dry wool. His right hand was wrapped in gauze and wool, and was elevated on a folded blanket, the way a corpsman elevates an extremity to encourage the slow movement of warm blood back into damaged tissue. His core temperature, measured at 5:30 in the morning with the rectal thermometer in the JTAC kit, had come back to 96.4, which was inside the band of recoverable hypothermia and on the right side of the line that mattered. Daniel Ross was sitting in the chair by the stove. He had not slept. He had not asked to sleep. He had sat through the rest of the night with one hand on the top of Tess's head. Tess had divided her time between the cot and the chair without being asked to, and he had watched Frank work. Daniel was a surgeon. He understood what he was watching. He had said, at 3:11 in the morning, after Frank had finished the third rewarming cycle on Caleb's feet and was repositioning the wool cloths on his hand, the only sentence Daniel would speak that night that was not about the immediate task. "I do not know who you are. I do not know how you knew." Frank had not answered. He had nodded. He had handed Daniel a tin cup of warm broth and pointed at the chair. The hand-cranked satellite phone was in the corner of the trestle next to Caleb's left foot. Frank had tried it at 3:30 and again at 5 and again at 6:15, and the phone had not found a satellite at any of those tries, because the weather above 30,000 feet was still wrong for the constellation that crossed the basin in those particular hours. The phone would not find a window until 7:42. Frank had a sense, the way men in his line of work develop a sense, of when satellites would and would not be available at his latitude, and he had not been worried at 3:30 or at 5. He was beginning to be worried at 6:15 because Caleb's right hand was not coming back, and he wanted a helicopter, and he wanted it before the second loss of consciousness that would, if it happened, very likely take Caleb with it. At 7:41, he picked the phone up. He cranked it. He waited. He cranked again. The acquisition light went green. He pressed the speed call to the Park Service Ranger Station at Wonder Lake. The ranger on duty was Hannah Mitchell. Frank had met her twice at the ranger station the previous summer when he had walked the 7 miles down to pick up a parcel his sister had sent up from Anchorage. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "Hannah, Frank Sutherland, I have 2 climbers off the Muldrow route. They are at my cabin. Daniel Ross, 38, walking. Caleb Marquez, 29, on the cot with 2nd-degree frostbite to both feet and 3rd-degree to 2 fingers of the right hand. Core temp, 96.4. He has been unstable. I need a helicopter. The window from here to McKinley Bar is open, and the wind is from the north at 6. Hannah took 30 seconds to confirm coordinates. She said, "I am calling the Black Hawk out of Talkeetna. ETA 70 minutes. Hold on the south face. We will see your roof." Frank said, "You will not see the cabin. You will see the lamp. Look for the lamp at the south window. The cabin is below grade except for the south wall." There was a small silence on Hannah's end. Then she said, "Understood. Lamp at the south window." Frank set the phone down. He put another piece of spruce in the stove. He raised the wick on the kerosene lamp on the trestle 2 slow turns. The flame doubled. He set the lamp on the sill. The Talkeetna Black Hawk crew put a litter down on the bench above the cavern at 8:47 in the morning. They were 2 pararescuemen and a flight medic, and they had flown a tight contour up from the McKinley bar with the lamp in their right window for the last 6 minutes of the approach. The lead PJ, a master sergeant named Reyes, who I am told later said the cabin was the cleanest casualty handoff he had taken in 11 years of high-altitude rescue work, took one look at Frank, at Caleb on the cot, at the JTAC kit on the floor, at the wool cloths in the warm water kettle, at the gauze on Caleb's right hand, at the unzipped door of the wood stove burning a clean, dry spruce fire, and at the Belgian malinois sitting on Caleb's left boot. And he said one sentence to Frank, which was, "Senior, where were you at?" Frank said, 8, Atlantic. Reyes nodded. He said, "We will take it from here, Senior." Then he and his second PJ packaged Caleb into the litter in the rapid economical motions of men who had done it 900 times. They walked Caleb up the slope to the helicopter. Reyes came back down twice, once for Daniel, who walked on his own with Reyes's hand under his elbow, and once to clip Frank's coffee tin to a carabiner he was wearing for some reason, and to hand the tin back to Frank empty. The helicopter lifted at 9:11. The downwash took 2 pieces of sod off the upper edge of the roof and laid them on the snow, and Frank walked up after the helicopter cleared the basin and pressed the sod back into place by hand. The roof took the patch the way Margaret had drawn it to take the patch. The seeding mix was already rooted. The panels still froze together within an hour. He sat on the trestle bench for the rest of that morning and the early afternoon, drinking coffee and writing in the green leather notebook. Tess slept across his right boot. The cabin held at 53 degrees through the morning as the porch thermometer climbed slowly from -34 to -26, which was the warming front Hannah had heard coming on the marine weather report at 7 that morning. He wrote the names of the 2 climbers and the times and the temperatures and the heart rates and the rewarming intervals and the fluid intake and the satellite phone window and the helicopter arrival time and the master sergeant's name and the things the master sergeant had said. He did not write what Daniel Ross had said at 3:11 in the morning. He did not write what he had felt when Caleb Marquez had stopped breathing for 9 seconds. Some things you do not put in a green notebook. Some things stay where they were. Hank Bowers walked in 7 days later. He arrived on the same quad and trailer his son had used to bring up the gravel 3.5 years before, with 2 thermoses of coffee instead of 1, and a brown paper sack of dry-cured ham, and the look on his face of a man who had been told something and had walked 4 miles to confirm it for himself. He did not say anything when Frank opened the door. He stood for a long time in the doorway and looked at the cot under the south window, which still had the dent of Caleb Marquez's body in the canvas, and at the trestle table, which still had the small dark spot where the rewarming water had soaked into the spruce, and at the small kerosene lamp on the shelf above. Then he walked across the room and put his hand flat against the south wall. He held his hand there for 19 seconds. I am counting because Frank counted, and Frank counted because what Hank was doing was the thing builders do when they want to feel through their palm whether a wall is alive. Hank's hand on the south wall told him the wall was at 51 degrees, which is what the inside face of a properly bermed 18-inch log wall reads when the outside is at -22, and the wall has been holding for 96 hours straight. He took his hand off the wall. He sat down at the trestle table. He took his ball cap off. He set it on the table. He said, "Frank." Frank waited. Hank said, "I owe your wife an apology." Frank looked at him for a moment. He said, "She would not have taken one." Hank thought about that. He said, "I am offering it anyway. Send it where she can hear it." Frank nodded. He poured 2 cups of coffee out of Hank's first thermos. They sat at Margaret's trestle table, the table she had drawn for 2, and they drank the coffee. And after a while, Hank asked the question he had walked 4 miles to ask, which was how the French drain had been angled at the upslope corner relative to the outlet 200 feet west under the alder. Frank pulled the drainage detail out of the cardboard tube and unrolled it on the table. The 2 old men sat over Margaret's drawing for the rest of the afternoon. They went through every reach of the French drain at 3% fall, and the birch bark vapor-permeable layer above the gravel, and the dovetail joinery without metal fasteners, and the center of roof flue placement, and the 30-degree sod angle, and the 18 inches of log above grade, and the single small window facing south, the only thing in the long sloping basin on a winter night that is not the same color as the snow. Hank read the side notes Margaret had written in her drafter's hand on the margin of the 3rd sheet. He sat for a long time over those side notes. Then he said, in a voice quieter than his usual voice, "She knew more about cold soil construction than most of the engineers I worked with in Anchorage in the 70s. Frank said yes, she did. Hank rolled the drawings up. He handed them back.
He put his ball cap on.
He drank the last of his coffee. He walked out. What Hank Bowers said about the cabin at the ranger station 2 weeks later, and at his nephew's lodge near Cantwell 3 weeks after that, and at the Park Service interpretive seminar in the Murie Science and Learning Center the following March, was that the cabin below the Wonder Lake bench was the most carefully engineered earth-banked structure he had seen built in the Upper Park Road corridor in 30 years of contracting work. He gave the credit to the drafter. He did not mention the SEAL who had built it. He had asked Frank, on his way out the door that afternoon, whether he could speak about the cabin in public, and Frank had said only that he did not want his name in it, and that he would prefer the drafter's name be used instead. Margaret Sutherland, Structural Drafter, PND Engineers, Anchorage. That is the name that appears in the small paragraph in the Park Service's interpretive notes about earth-banked construction in the Wonder Lake Basin. That is the only name in the paragraph. The Valley spoke of the cabin through the spring of 2023, the way a valley speaks of something that has worked. The rescue made the small print of the Anchorage Daily News on the 18th. The reporter did not have Frank's name. Daniel Ross and Caleb Marquez gave the reporter their version of the night, and Daniel said that the only reason they had come down the right drainage in the end was that one small amber light visible against the slope from the upper edge of the McKinley Bar, and that they had walked toward that light because it was the only thing for the entire 10 miles of their descent that was not the same color as the snow. Caleb Marquez kept all but the distal phalanx of his right index finger. He took the loss with the equanimity of a young attorney who had already understood, lying on a cot with a Belgian malinois on his boot at -34, that the loss had been the cheap part of the bill. He sent Frank a letter in April. The letter was 3 sentences long. The 3rd sentence read, "Tell your wife that her drainage trench held at -34 and the warm cloths saved my feet, and the dog saved the rest of me." Frank put the letter in the cardboard tube with the drawings. It is in the tube as I write this. I want to close this where it belongs, which is on a Sunday evening in the 2nd week of April, after the long, slow thaw above the seep had finally started, and the French drain Margaret had drawn at 3% fall to daylight had been moving meltwater for 9 days without interruption. Frank sat at the trestle table at the south window with the cardboard tube against the wall to his